There is a man in the water. He is somewhere off a small Japanese island in the Pacific, in a rubber raft the size of a bathtub, bleeding from the head, throwing up seawater. The shore is close enough that he can see it. And on that shore are men who, if they reach him first, will not take him prisoner in any way he would want to survive. He is 20 years old. He has just watched his own airplane fall into the ocean, and both of the men who flew with him are lost. By every rule of this war, he is already gone. A pilot who goes down in this ocean on this side of it does not usually come back. And then the sea in front of him breaks open, and the black hull of an American submarine rises out of it, and a hand reaches down for him. This is the story of that hand, of the strange, expensive decision behind it, and of what it did to the enemy watching from the shore when they finally understood that the Americans had come all that way into their water to take back one man. Every Air Force in the Second World War lost men over water. It is the nature of the thing. You send a boy up in a machine, and sometimes the machine comes apart in the sky, and if he is lucky, he gets out of it. And then he is alone on the largest and emptiest surface on Earth. The question was never whether men would fall into the sea. The question was what happened next. For most of the war, for most of the men who fought it, the answer was nothing. You fell and you waited, and the ocean took its time. What the United States built in the Pacific, quietly, without medals or headlines, was an answer to that silence. It built a system whose entire purpose was to go and get the falling man back. And here is the part that mattered more than anyone planned. The enemy noticed. The Japanese pilots and sailors who watched it happen could not explain it, and could not match it. And slowly it did something to them that the loss of ships and islands had not. It told them exactly what kind of country they were losing to. Not a richer one, not just a bigger one. A country that would spend a warship and risk a whole crew to pull one ordinary man out of the water. And once you have seen your enemy do that, and you know that no one is coming for you, you start to do the math on your own life. It is a slow poison to carry, and it helped end the war. Start with what it was actually like, because the numbers mean nothing until you feel the water. A carrier pilot in the Pacific flew over distances that are hard to hold in your head. He took off from a moving airfield, flew for an hour or more over open ocean, did the most dangerous work a person can do, and then had to find that same small moving airfield again in all that blue. There were no roads under him, no fields to put down in. If something went wrong, there was the sea, and only the sea. When he was hit, he had seconds. Get the canopy back. Fight the airplane level long enough for the men behind him to get out. Then go himself into a slipstream that could break bones, hoping the parachute filled, hoping he cleared the tail. And if all of that worked, if he lived through the thing that was supposed to kill him, he came down into cold salt water hundreds of miles from anything, and the war simply went on without him. The other planes were specks now, heading home. The sound faded, and he was left with a one-man raft, a dye marker that stained the water a hopeful green, and a radio that might or might not be heard. Then came the waiting. Men waited hours, men waited days. Some drifted for weeks, and a few of those drifted into stories that end the way you are afraid they end. The sun burned them by day, and the cold shook them by night. Sharks were not a Hollywood invention. Thirst was worse than sharks. Every man who flew over that ocean carried the arithmetic of it in the back of his mind. He knew that the distance which made his job possible was the same distance that would swallow him if he fell. He flew anyway. They all flew anyway. The difference, The thing this whole story turns on is what that man was allowed to believe while he sat in the raft, whether he could tell himself, "They know I am down here, and they are coming," or whether he had to sit with the other sentence, "No one is coming." Because the Americans decided, on purpose, that their men would get to believe the first sentence. And that decision has a name. They called it lifeguard duty. Somewhere around early 1943, the U.S. Navy started doing something with its submarines that, on paper, made very little sense. A fleet submarine was one of the most valuable and aggressive weapons in the ocean. Its job was to hunt, to sink ships, to hide. And now, before a big carrier airstrike, one of these boats would be sent to sit off the enemy coast, on the surface, in daylight, near the very place the airplanes were going to attack. Not to sink anything, to wait for Americans to fall out of the sky and to go pick them up. Think about the trade for a second. You are taking a submarine, a crew of 70 or 80 men, and you are parking it in harm's way, deliberately, as a favor to whoever might crash that day. The men on that submarine did not get to choose whether the pilot was worth it. They just waited, and watched the sky, and went in when someone came down. They got good at it. They built a whole quiet language for it. A downed pilot could call a position using code words, cartoon names, so the enemy listening in could not use it. 14 miles from Point Papa Bugs, bearing 135. A submarine somewhere below the horizon would hear that, and turn, and come. And the numbers tell you it was a machine, not luck. Late in the war, the Navy looked back at dozens of these rescue missions and found something stark. When a submarine had aircraft flying cover for it, calls for help turned into rescues again and again. When a submarine had to go in alone, without that cover, most of the calls ended in nothing, which means the Americans had learned the exact recipe: fighters plus submarine plus a code, to reach into the enemy's own front yard and lift a man out of the water while people shot at them for trying. Over the course of the war, American submarines on this duty pulled more than 500 airmen out of the Pacific. 500 men who, in almost any other army in history, would simply have been gone. Names crossed off, letters sent home. One submarine, the Tang, off a place called Truk, picked up 22 of them in a single operation. 22 men in the water, one boat, going in again and again with the enemy shore right there, until the deck was crowded with rescued pilots who an hour earlier had been writing themselves off. The captain earned one of the Navy's highest unit honors for it. But ask yourself what the 22 remembered. Not the citation. The hull coming up out of the water. The hand. Nobody made a movie about lifeguard duty. It had no glory in it. It was boring and terrifying, and it saved a specific, countable number of specific men, each of whom went home and had children and grandchildren who exist because a submarine crew decided one life was worth the risk to the boat. That is one side of this ocean. Now look at the other. The Japanese pilot who flew against the Americans was, especially early in the war, as good as any airman alive. His training was brutal and long. His airplane, the Zero, could turn inside almost anything the Allies put up. Man for man, in 1942, he was often the better flyer. And when he went into the water, his country did almost nothing to get him back. This is not a small detail. It is one of the deepest differences between the two sides, and the Japanese themselves paid for it in a currency they could not print more of: trained men. Japan built no real system to recover downed flyers. There was no lifeguard submarine waiting offshore for him. There was no code, no cover, no boat coming up out of the sea. A Japanese pilot who bailed out over open ocean was, in most cases, simply lost. Thousands of them went into that water, and no one came, and that was the end of it. You can see the gap most clearly in a single battle. In the great carrier fight in the Marianas in the summer of 1944, the Japanese lost hundreds of aircraft, and with them hundreds of pilots, of whom only a small fraction were ever pulled from the sea. On the American side of the same battle, most of the flyers who came down in the water were found and fished out, and were in some cases flying again within days. One side treated the man as the weapon. The other side treated the airplane as the weapon and the man as ammunition. And a country can survive running low on airplanes. Factories make airplanes. What Japan could not replace, what no factory anywhere makes, was the 25-year-old who had 400 hours in the air and had lived through Midway and knew what he was doing. Every one of those men who drowned in silence was a piece of the war Japan could never get back. By the last year, they were sending up boys with a fraction of the training, against Americans who kept getting their veterans back out of the ocean. But the deepest cost was not on any chart. It was in the head of the man in the raft, because he knew. The Japanese pilot sitting in the water knew that no one was coming for him. He had watched it happen to his friends. And a man who knows that he is expendable, that his own side has already written him off the moment he splashed down, carries something heavier than fear. He carries the knowledge that to his own commanders, he was always going to be ammunition. Now, set those two men next to each other in the same ocean on the same day. One of them is waiting for a submarine he has been promised will come. The other is waiting for nothing, and knows it. They are not fighting the same war anymore. They stopped fighting the same war the moment they hit the water. Somewhere in a lot of American families, there is a man who came home from that ocean when, by the odds, he should not have. A pilot, a gunner, a sailor on a boat that went in after someone. If that man is in your family, I am going to ask you for his name before the end of this. Keep him in mind while we go on. This is, in the end, about him. Here is where the story turns from logistics into something stranger, something the Japanese wrote about in their own letters and diaries because they could not stop thinking about it. They watched it happen. A Japanese lookout on a small island or a pilot circling above would see an American plane go down and then see the impossible, an American submarine surface, in the open, under fire, and take the time to lift one man off the water before slipping away. And the question that came into his mind was not a military question, it was almost a moral one. Why would they do that? Why would a nation spend so much and risk so much for one person who was already, by the cold logic of war, a loss? To a man who had been taught since boyhood that he himself was a small part of something huge, that his own death was expected, even beautiful, that his commanders would spend him without hesitation, the American behavior did not compute. It was not just that the Americans had more. Everyone knew the Americans had more. It was that they acted as if each individual man was worth the whole apparatus, as if the machine existed to serve the person and not the other way around. And slowly, that observation curdles into a conclusion. If they will do that for one pilot, then they are not going to break. The reason is not that they are braver. It is that their men go into the fight already believing that if they fall, their own side will come for them. Their morale does not rest on a knife edge the way ours does, because their men are not sitting in rafts doing the arithmetic of abandonment. Their men are sitting in rafts, hurt and afraid, but believing. And belief like that, multiplied by a whole navy, is a kind of armor you cannot shoot through. That is the thing the Japanese pilot could not understand about the man he shot down. He had done everything right. He had won the duel. He had put the American into the sea, which by every rule should have been the end of it. And then the sea gave the man back. And the pilot was left with the feeling, growing colder every month of the war, that he was fighting a country that refused to accept its own losses, and would keep coming, and would get its dead men up out of the water and send them back at him. You do not win a war of nerves against an enemy like that. You just slowly stop believing you can win it at all. I have been keeping one man out of this on purpose, because he is the whole thing in a single life. And most of you already know his name, which is exactly why it matters. On the 2nd of September 1944, a 20-year-old torpedo bomber pilot took off from a light carrier called the San Jacinto to attack a radio station on a Japanese island in the Bonins, an island called Chichi Jima. His name was George Bush. 44 years later, he would be President of the United States. That morning, he was just one more very young man doing the most dangerous job in the fleet. His plane was hit on the run-in. He described it later as a jolt, as if a massive fist had crunched into the belly of the plane. Smoke filled the cockpit. Flames started crawling toward the fuel. And here is the part that tells you who he was at 20. He stayed on the target, released his bombs, and only then turned out to sea and told the crew to get out. There were 2 other men in that airplane, a radio man named John Delaney and a gunner named Ted White. Neither of them came home. Another parachute was seen to come out of the plane besides his own, but it did not save the man, and to the end of his life, Bush was never sure whether either of them had gotten out in time. He went into the water alone, cut and bleeding and sick. His crew was gone, and then he began the wait we have been talking about. In a raft, off an enemy island, doing the arithmetic. And the submarine came. The USS Finback, on lifeguard duty, surfaced and took him out of the water and carried him away. He spent a month aboard that submarine, standing watches in the middle of the night, alive because the system we have been describing did exactly what it was built to do. Now hold the 2 islands against each other, because the contrast is the entire point, and it is almost unbearable. On that same island, Chichi Jima, other American airmen were shot down in those weeks and did not have a submarine waiting. They were captured. And what happened to the men who were captured there is one of the darkest things in the whole Pacific War. They did not come home. The difference between George Bush and those men was not skill, and it was not courage. It was a submarine. It was whether, when you hit the water, someone had been sent to come and get you. One man went into the sea near that island and became a president. Others went into the hands on that shore and have graves you have never heard of, or no graves at all. The same sky, the same week, the only variable was whether America had put a boat in the water to catch its own. You would think being the one who is saved is a pure gift. It is not. It comes with a bill that takes a lifetime to pay. George Bush carried John Delaney and Ted White for the rest of his life. As an old man, decades later, he could still barely talk about it without his voice going. He said, and I want to give you his own words, that he was not haunted by anything except the feeling that he was responsible for the lives of the 2 men who were killed. He said, "Why me? Why was I spared?" and told people that the question had plagued him for 60 years. When a historian went to interview him about that day, this former President of the United States asked the historian, almost shyly, whether there was any new information about what had happened to his 2 crewmen. That is what it costs to be the man the submarine reaches. You spend the 60 years you were given wondering why you got them, and the other 2 did not. The rescue that looks so clean from the outside, the hull, the hand, the man lifted from the sea, is also the beginning of a very long and very quiet grief. And here is what I want you to sit with. Every one of those 500 rescued men had a version of that. Every single one went home carrying somebody who did not. The system did not just save lives. It created a whole generation of men who lived on the sharp knowledge that they were the lucky one, and that luck had a name and a face, sometimes two. We should stop before the end for the other men in this story. The ones on the submarine. Lifeguard duty was not a reward. It meant taking your boat, your one fragile shell between 80 men and the bottom of the ocean, and holding it on the surface, in daylight, right where the enemy knew to look. Submarines survive by being invisible. On Lifeguard Station, you threw that away on purpose and sat in plain sight, hour after hour, so that if someone fell, you would be close enough to matter. They did not know the pilot. He was not from their crew, not their friend, often not even from their branch of the service. He was just a voice on the radio and a stain of green dye on the water. And they went in for him anyway. They surfaced under fire for a stranger. Some of them worked out how to do it with the periscope while barely showing themselves, lifting a man out of the water while staying half hidden because they wanted to save him and survive it too. Nobody knows their names now. The pilot they saved became, in one case, a president, and the world remembers the man in the raft. The men who ran the boat that came for him went home and said almost nothing about it, and if you asked them what they did in the war, a lot of them would have shrugged and said, "Submarines," and left it there. They were the hand at the end of the arm, and the hand does not usually get remembered, only the man it saved. So let me put it as plainly as I can, because this is the whole thing. An army that will turn a submarine around for one man is telling its enemy something that no weapon can say. It is saying, we believe every single one of these people is worth coming back for. And a man who knows that, who sits in the water hurt and afraid, but certain that his country is on its way, fights a different war than the man across from him who knows he has already been written off. One of them has hope built into the machine around him. The other one is doing the arithmetic of abandonment. In the end, that gap decided as much as any battle did. The Japanese pilot never could understand it. He shot the American down, fair and square, and the sea handed the man back, and it broke something in him that no defeat in the air ever had. He was not just losing. He was losing to a people who would not leave their own behind. And somewhere in the cold water off those islands, he began to understand what it means to fight a country that will not leave its own to drown. More than 500 men came home out of that ocean who should not have. They went back to their towns and their jobs and their families, and most of them never said much about the day the sea opened up and a submarine took them out of it. They just lived the lives that the hand had given back to them. Somewhere in your family there may be one of those lives, a man who flew or dove or sailed in the Pacific and came home when he should not have, because somebody was sent to go and get him. If he is there, leave his name below, just his name and where he served, if you know it. I read every one of them, and every name left in that water gets one more of these men pulled back up and remembered out loud. They came back for him once. The least we can do is come back for his name.